Hi there and welcome back to the podcast Father Ed Talks. This is episode 2. I'm so happy to welcome you back, particularly if you've visited my channel before. If you are new to the channel, my name is Edward and I am your host, and I am a Christian priest living in Wales in the United Kingdom. Welcome, it's so good to have you. So today is episode 2 of the podcast. And although it's episode 2, it's part 1 of 2. I'm sorry, it's very complicated. But the question I want to talk about today is, why am I still a Christian? Part 1. Next episode will be, why am I still a Christian? Part 2. So today in part 1, I want to specifically focus on why I am still a Christian in a world where there is so much unnecessary pain, evil, and suffering. Part 2 is going to focus on why am I still a Christian in an age of reason, in an age of science. So I just thought it would be best not to go on too long for each episode and to split them into 2. So in this part 1, I really want to dig deep and focus on this particular question of why do I still believe in a good God when there is so much unnecessary evil in the world? And so to begin in this part 1, I really want to highlight what I believe is, well, the question on all of our hearts and minds. And specifically, really pinpoint what the actual problem is. So if I may highlight the question like this. Why would I still believe in the Christian God, who we believe to be goodness itself, when there is so much pain, hurt, evil, all of which are unnecessary in the world around us? Why do we have to suffer when there is a good God who could just take it away? I hope that that is highlighting the major problem here that we are trying to discuss and look at. And I hope I've done justice to highlighting the problem. The second thing I want to say is that this question has been wrestled with for centuries and centuries. We know that this kind of question was discussed from the ancient Greek philosophers right up into the present day. Obviously, I'm making this podcast. And I just wanted to pinpoint a particular character who lived in the 13th century who he really tried to grapple with this. And he explained it a little bit more abstract, in an abstract way, that I hope to share with you. So he said, oh, by the way, his name is Thomas Aquinas, just in case anyone was wondering. So he said that if two infinites exist, if there be two opposite infinites, then it's impossible. One would just cease to exist. So for example, he said, in a universe where there is infinite heat, there cannot be any cold, because there's just nothing but heat, so cold can't exist. So he said, well, if God is good and the infinite goodness, then there cannot be any evil or pain or suffering in the world. There cannot be anything which is not good. And this is a really, really clever way of putting it, and a really serious question. So I wanted to engage with this question primarily by discussing a personal experience that I had, but then also looking at some of what we call the wisdom literature from the Bible. Now, I'm going to ask you to bear with me because it's just typical, isn't it, for a Christian when asked a question about something. Oh, well, we'll look at the Bible. But the reason we're going to do that is because there is so much depth of human experience expressed in the Bible that I think it is really important. So I was hoping to share my personal experience of you. It was something that happened several years ago. For me, it was a time, it was a really dark place, a really bad space to be in with my mental health. I suffer with anxiety, and those of us who do suffer with anxiety know how crippling, how very crippling it can be. And what I mean by that is when we experience a spiral of negativity where it's just getting worse and worse with the kind of what if questions. What if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? And you feel like you cannot escape because your mind is just consumed with just negativity. You feel trapped. You feel you cannot escape these feelings. It's a despair. It's an anguish that can be just terrible. And as I say, those of us who experience this will know exactly what I'm talking about. So this happened. Well, it happens quite regularly to varying degrees of severity, but this was a particularly bad place. And as I say, it happened several years ago. Those of you who listened to the last podcast will know that I was born and grew up in South Africa, and we moved here to the UK. And as a family, we struggled not only to fit in culturally, to understand the culture around us, we also struggled financially. So my mum and dad struggled to find work, and then when we did, it wasn't a very happy or positive experience. And this was the first time in my life that I knew this kind of anxiety, knew this kind of threat. And my mind would often go to places like, well, what if we can't pay this bill? What if we can't pay for that? And then progressing to, what if we can't make the rent? And what happens if we get evicted? We don't know anyone else. What's going to happen? That fear of destitution was a constant, presence with me. It was just something I could not escape. Eventually, my dad was offered a very good job, and this was wonderful because this was our ticket out of this experience. It was a permanent job, it was paid well, it was along the lines of the work that my dad had done in South Africa. This was, I cannot tell you the relief that I had. And although I had this relief, I could not shake those anxious feelings. I kept thinking, well, something's going to go wrong. It's too good to be true. We all know that experience, don't we? Where we think, gosh, that's just too good to be true. And despite my parents trying to console me, to reason with me that I didn't need to worry anymore, I could not escape it. And I found myself one day sitting in a park reading a book in the midst, in this storm of anxiety. And I was reading, it was a little bit ironic, I was reading this book about positive thinking and trying to change my thought process. I was trying to fight and get out of this despair, this really dark place, as I say. And the book was all about positivity, but my mind was all about negativity. And the book was trying to trying to suggest that you can change your thinking by taking positive steps to change your perspective. And what it was doing, it was using particular Bible passages to say, focus on the positivity here and let that affect all aspects of your life. And I remember, as I say, sitting in this park filled with despair, filled with these feelings of anxiety. And in the book, the author mentioned a particular scene from Jesus' life in the Bible. And in this scene, Jesus happened to be walking one day with his friends, and he was approached by two people. These two people were affected with leprosy. And those of us who don't know about people who are affected with leprosy, you were historically totally ostracized from society. And because of the highly contagious nature of leprosy, you did not interact with these people. And as I say, historically, you were totally ostracized and treated as such. Now, these two people approached Jesus and shouted to him, saying, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us." And what they for us, what they were saying essentially was, Jesus, please help us. Please help us. And when I read Jesus's reply, something happened, and it was one of those things that will stay with me forever. Jesus's reply to them was, do you believe I can do this? In other words, do you believe I can help you? And all of a sudden, it felt as if these words were no longer on the page, and these words were being spoken to me. And I mentioned a similar experience in the previous podcast, episode 1, Why Did I Choose to Become a Priest? The sentence, this, do you believe I can do this, was suddenly spoken to me. And for me, I believe it wasn't so much Jesus on the page answering these two people, but he was asking me. In other words, Jesus was confronting me. He was saying, you are, going through this. You are trying to find a way out. Do you believe I can help you? Do you believe that I can, help? And I found my response in the words that the two people affected with leprosy, what they said. They said, yes, Lord, I believe you can do this. That experience, as I say, it was extremely strange. And again, it was my voice in my head, but it was not my voice. And it was this confrontation. Edward, do you believe I can help you? And for me, it was such a wake-up call for me in my faith. And as I say, it's something that I will remember for a long time. So, what did that experience do? What was going on there? How can we make sense of it? And what kind of a response? Let's just follow my line of thinking and say that was an encounter with God, and that was God's response to my feelings of being in this really dark place, my feelings of being in this bad space. If that was God's response to me, well, what really was going on there? And so for me, this is where we're going to need to turn to the wisdom literature that I mentioned earlier in the Bible, because there are 3 particular books in the Bible that seek to answer this question of how do we live well in the world around us. And so I'm hoping to share that with you now. Okay, so these 3 books within the Bible, I just have to say immediately that there is so much depth to these books, and in this podcast I'm just literally going to scrape the cream off the top of the cake. There's so much that can be said, but the 3 books that I want to focus on are the books Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. In the book of Proverbs, what the author of the book is trying to suggest is that the wisdom of God is something that is a presence with us, and that it is kind of like woven into the fabric of the universe. And so Proverbs is trying to sell us this idea that those people who make wise and good decisions are participating, are like sharing in, are like tapping into the wisdom of God. And that means that when we do that, good things are going to happen. And we can see that, we can see like clever people, intelligent people, wise people making good decisions, and they tend to reap good rewards from their decisions. And people who make poor decisions, people who fight against that, end up reaping the rewards of those poor decisions. So to summarize in the words of Proverbs, it says, the waywardness of fools will destroy them, but the wisdom of the just helps them live in security. And that's the long and the short of what Proverbs is trying to say. that God is just, and God's wisdom and justice is woven into the universe, and everyone can share in that by making good decisions. So the second book, Ecclesiastes, comes along and says, whoa, hang on a second, that's far too simplistic. Almost like, come on, get real. Because the author of Ecclesiastes is suggesting that that's not always the case. Sometimes really, really bad things happen to really, really good people. And that's just a fact of life. So Ecclesiastes asks the question through, again, very, very dense poetry. Is God really just? And so we have this kind of scale where it's just tipped in the balance. Is God really just in life? Is it all fair? What's going on? And so the third book, the book of Job, is where this question of is God really just is really explored. I do want to take us through the story because I think it's really important and I think it's just going to make sense. So yeah, bear with me. The opening of the book begins with this kind of like divine council where God is there, and present with him are all of his angels, stuff like that. And God is saying, look at my servant Job. And Job is this kind of like wise, seasoned, like old man who has seen it all. And God is saying, look how good Job is. Look how faithful he is. Look how wonderful he is. And isn't he great, basically? And one of the angelic host, one of these angels present at this divine council, the text refers to him as the Satan. We might say Satan. Now, just bear with me. I know the story's a little bit weird. But the Satan approaches God and says, I don't believe you. I think Job is kind of just working the system. He's only faithful and good to you because he's got good things in life. Let me take away all of the good things that he knows. Let me make him suffer. And then you will see Job's real colours. And it's amazing because God says, yeah, okay, sure, that's fine. Like, whoa, that raises huge questions. But again, stay with me. So the Satan visits all kinds of evil on Job. It is absolutely devastating, and he loses everything. He loses his family. He loses his livelihood, and he knows all manner of disease. It is absolutely devastating. But in all of the suffering, Job is still faithful, believing that God is good. And eventually, 4 friends of Job come to him and try and make sense of his suffering. They say, we know that God is just, therefore there must be something that you have done in life that has justified God's vengeance on you. And they, for chapter after chapter after chapter, try and suggest things that Job might have done to justify why he's suffering like this. And throughout it all, Job is saying he is innocent of it. And we know Job is perfectly innocent. Even God said so at the beginning of the story. And finally, Job reacts in a rage. He's got this inner turmoil where he's thinking, well, I know God is faithful and just, but why am I suffering like this? And eventually he descends into this almighty rage against God, where he curses the day that he is born. And he calls God out. He demands that God come and justify himself, because he knows that his suffering in life is totally unjust. And God does. In the longest speech made by God in the Old Testament, God comes and appears to Job in this massive storm, this massive whirlwind. And this is God's response. He says to him, Job, where were you when I formed the heavens and the earth? Where were you at the beginning of time, where I created all things visible and invisible? Where were you when I, did this and that in the universe? And he kind of takes Job on this tour of the cosmos, and he shows Job all of the complexity of the world, the amazing detail in life, the amazing patterns that are there that Job has no concept of. And finally, he shows Job these two great beasts called Behemoth and Leviathan. And like people try to say, oh, it's just a crocodile and a hippopotamus. But in the text, it's more than that. And God is basically bragging in this, and he's saying, look at the wonder of these creatures. I made them, and you had no idea about them. Now, these creatures are dangerous. They, if we think of like a whale or something like that, if you go near them, it's dangerous. And yeah, but that does not mean, this was God's point, that does not mean that they are bad. And that's it. That is God's response to Job. And that raises all kinds of questions. Okay, so I think it's quite important at this moment to stop and just draw out some conclusions. The first thing I just would like us to take away from this is that this is an exploration of God's justice through poetry. So for us it's unwise to take these descriptions of God too far. Okay? So what I mean by that is we just need to take the results and points of what the poetry is trying to point us to. So, for example, well, where does this leave Job in this experience? Well, it leaves him with this profound sense of humility. He recognizes that his perspective on life is really just a blip, and that he cannot compute the complexities of the things around him. Whereas what the text is trying to say is that when God makes decisions, God is taking the full complexity of the universe into consideration when making decisions. So God's perspective on the world is infinitely larger than ours. Okay, so what are some of the things that we can take away from that? But first, we just need to finish the story very briefly. In the end of the story, everything is returned to Job. So his livelihood, to his family, to his health, all of it is restored, and it's more than restored, it's doubled. He knows more wealth and benefit and love than he has ever experienced before. And the text is keen to point out, this is not a reward for Job. This is not, well done, you've passed my test, so here are more good things. But what the text is trying to say is that God, in his wisdom, has decided to bless Job with these things. So it's not a reward. Okay, so where does that leave us? So for me, just reflecting back on my own experience where I felt that question to me was God talking to me, saying, do you trust me? Do you trust that I can help you? And that is pretty much what Job was told. It was this kind of confrontation. So I didn't get an answer as to why I was experiencing anxiety and why I couldn't escape. There was no explanation as to why it was happening. But it was a call to trust. It was a call to recognize that, God is there and that he's going to see me through. The same thing was pointed out to Job in this incredibly grand way, this poetic way of taking him on this tour of the cosmos. The same thing is said to Job. I am here, and I am going to look after you, and I'm asking you to trust me. Because in my wisdom, which means that in my perspective, which has the whole universe in mind, I am making decisions. So God is not so much saying that trust in me and bad things are not going to happen. No, bad things are going to happen. But good things are going to happen as well. And I am going to bring about good things. So even in the very best experiences and even in the very worst experience, please, I'm asking you to trust me. This is God's response to Job. So that personal experience is, for me, the reason why I am still a Christian in our world where there is so much obvious and unnecessary pain and evil. From my perspective, it is unnecessary, and I don't and never will understand why we experience these things and why we go through these things, why we see so much hurt and pain in the world around us. For me, because of my experience, I know I'm never going to understand it necessarily and understand the reasons why it is happening. But because of that experience, I feel I am able to trust. And I realize that that might appear to be like a cop-out and not good enough for some people. But this is my experience and why I am still a Christian. Because I believe that these bad things that we can go through in life will ultimately end in something good, a good beyond our imagining. If I can just use one more description of why I think that, it's just going to be a reflection on the life of Jesus. We know at the end of his life, the sort of the climax of his time was crucifixion. This experience of extraordinary pain, this experience of extraordinary prejudice and persecution, which ultimately resulted in his death. As Christians, we believe that God in his fullness takes on human flesh. So God was experiencing that pain and that suffering in Jesus. But we know that that was not the end of Jesus' story. We know that although he went through all of those terrible things, we know that there was the resurrection. On Easter Sunday, he came back to life, the resurrection of his body. I suppose, for me, when reflecting on why God is calling me to trust him, I always think of that God was prepared himself to go through all of that, what we can perceive to be unnecessary suffering. But in that, he created this incredible goodness, this incredible new life that as humanity we are all called to share in. And yeah, that for me is why I am still a Christian, because after every Good Friday, Easter Sunday is coming. So guys, I hope that this has been an interesting podcast for you. I have no doubt that this has raised many, many more questions for you, so I would be so grateful to hear from you. If you'd be prepared to leave your questions in the comments below or message me on Instagram, I'd just love to hear from you. And yeah, I mean, this was my experience and me trying to answer these very, very, very deep and heavy questions. So yeah, please, I'd love to hear from you. And if you feel that you'd like to hear more, just let me know. As I say, part 2 is coming. Why am I still a Christian in an age of reason and science? Yeah, so stay tuned. And sincerely, guys, thank you so much for for listening. I'm so grateful, and sincerely, I hope you all have a good day.